And its title was this: Trump's new judicial litmus test, shrinking the administrative state. I wanted to find out what was that all about, so I had the pleasure of speaking with Leonard Leo. He's the advisor to the president on judicial nominations and the man that many credit with convincing the president to put Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court. I talked to him about how President Trump's judicial appointments are helping to fight the bureaucracy of the administrative state. Take a look. Joining me from Washington, Executive Vice President of the Federalist Society, Leonard Leo. Leonard, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I really am thrilled to have you here. I just want to make sure that our viewers understand what a significant person you are. You've been described by some as the most powerful recruiter in the world, the conservative pipeline to the Supreme Court, less kindly perhaps, but just as much emphasizing your influence, the judicial puppet master. What they're talking about is the fact that you're the person that is in the lead in terms of advising President Trump and the administration on judicial appointments, not just most notably Neil Gorsuch, but actually right the way through the judicial system, leaving an incredibly important legacy, probably the most important lasting legacy from this president. And I just wanted our audience to understand that you're in the driving seat there. And I'd love to start with the big picture. What is the legal philosophy you're bringing to that advice that you're giving the president and the administration on judicial appointments?
Well, basically, the idea is that judges ought to be interpreting the Constitution the way the framers meant it to be, according to its words, very specifically, and that the courts have a role to play in enforcing all those structural features of the Constitution that limit the power of our government, because ultimately it's that protection of freedom that the courts can do by enforcing the structural limits on government power.
And do you think that the way that appointments have been made in the past have gone in a direction away from that?
Not in this administration, but in prior administrations, particularly during the Obama administration, there were a lot of judicial appointees who didn't believe that the courts had a role to play in enforcing the structural limits on government power, which are so important to the preservation of freedom and dignity.
So I just wanted to get now into the detail of it. I think the discussion around Neil Gorsuch has been widely had. A lot of people familiar with his views and what he brings to the Supreme Court. I want to focus on a subject that we talk about a lot here on this show, whatever you want to call it, the administrative state, the deep state, the way in which there's this sense of a permanent bureaucracy that advances an agenda. And I want to start by going into something that many people will think is very nerdy and wonky, but actually really at the heart of this. There's a ruling, isn't there, that's vital to this notion of the role of the judiciary in relation to the administration of government, and that's the Chevron case. And that was one of the things that I think that really recommended Justice Gorsuch. Could you just explain to us the significance of the Chevron case and what it means for the administrative state?
Sure. Well, first of all, Steve, I'm really glad you brought this up, because at the end of the day, this was the first Supreme Court confirmation where this whole issue was front and center. And basically, the debate was about the extent to which judges ought to be deferring to decisions that are made by administrative agencies. And what was the subject of such debate during the Gorsuch confirmation was Neil Gorsuch's view that judges have a very important role to play in ensuring that administrative agencies are accountable, transparent, and fair. And that means judges shouldn't just roll over and play dead every time an administrative agency or a regulator makes a decision. Judges have a duty, a constitutional duty, to look carefully at what the administrative agency is doing and to make sure it's staying within the bounds of its power as defined either by the Constitution or by a statute within the U.S. Code.
That's so important, isn't it? Because what you've seen happen is this shift of power to the administrative state in its various forms. And it sounds like what you're trying to do here is correct that and shift the power back to where it should be. The last question I wanted to ask you was about how this is being applied beyond the Supreme Court. There was a story in the New York Times the other week, which the headline is that Trump's new judicial litmus test, shrinking the administrative state. And it argues that actually one of the most significant things that's going on with this administration, driven by the philosophy that you've outlined, is the appointment of judges throughout the system who've got this attitude about shrinking or putting, at least putting the administrative state back within the confines that it should be in. Would you accept that characterization that shrinking the administrative state is a litmus test for the judges that you're recommending?
I wouldn't really say that it's about shrinking the administrative state. The president's certainly doing that in his deregulatory agenda. But what this is really about is making sure that administrative agencies live by the law. In other words, that when they are making decisions, that they are respecting the statutes that created their agency and the Constitution of the United States. And it's a judge's job to basically look at what those agencies are doing and make sure they're following the law. That's accountability, it's transparency, it's living up to the separation of powers in our Constitution. And judges have a duty to make sure that administrative agencies are following the law, just as they have a duty to make sure that Congress or the president or anyone else that wields government authority is following the law.
Leonard, it's amazing that is actually seen by some as a radical shift. It just shows how far power's gone in the wrong direction. But I think that what you're doing there to try and bring it back to what the Constitution intended is just heroic work. I really, really appreciate it, and I'm so glad that we had a chance